I began as a chaplain intern at the VA in Nashville in May of 2008. And shortly after that, I was asked by my supervisor there if I would serve as his voting alternate for the IRB. So the beginning of clinical work in hospitals and research ethics started at almost the same time for me. As it so happens, that was also right around the time that Primer had its AER conference in Nashville. So I was invited by the IRB at Nashville to attend, and when I was there, I really felt very at home in the community of folks here, and I actually joined on site that year and have been a member ever since, sometimes with the gracious support of Primer in some of the lean years. But it's been important for me to even ask to help keep that membership alive even when I couldn't afford it myself, because I've wanted to remain connected with this community. It's actually the first professional organization that I joined. So I continue to serve as a voting alternate on the IRB while I was at the VA as a chaplain resident. Then when I left to work for an outside hospice as their sole chaplain, I was asked by the IRB if I would stay on as their community member or one of the community members. And I agreed because, again, I really felt at home in the conversation that happens around research ethics and that happens in discussions around individuals' studies. So I said yes, and here I am still. I'm not much of an institution guy, so part of me thought my supervisor really seems to think that I'll be good in this environment, but being good in this environment, I'm not sure if I believed meant that I was actually going to enjoy being in that environment. So before going there, it sounded like a committee meeting in an institution like a hospital, neither of which sound amazingly exciting, which I think then is part of the reason why I reacted so strongly in a positive fashion once I was there and realized, oh, there's some really interesting conversations going on in here. Granted, there may be a lot of sort of minutia and arcane details, regulations, which I'll never master, nor probably have much of an interest in mastering. But the broad swaths of conversation, the broad swaths of subject areas that were being discussed, I just reveled in. And you know, I'll have to say, backing up for just a second, that part of me feels like it's this field that I was meant to be part of for so long, the conversations that I was always excited about. And even though I'd had some sort of intro to ethics classes and enjoyed those classes, I'd never really thought about how do I get involved in these conversations. So my supervisor was really smart. Chaplain Tom Phillips, wherever you are, right? Kudos to you for that. But the second part of that is wow, there's this whole sort of amazing, robust world of ethics that then also became, for me, conversations on the clinical side and research side that they've been a huge playground for me. I really, really love the conversations. I love thinking about these areas. And again, I think one of the reasons that I enjoy it so much is that I can be a 10,000-foot person a lot of times, and I try to work hard to remind myself to be grounded. And this is one of those areas, both on the clinical and research side, so sort of healthcare ethics more broadly, but where it's this 10,000-foot view that has immediate cash out. with a person's experience, with a patient's experience, with a participant's experience. And that is really fantastic to me. It's not a philosophical discussion of ethics, which is important, and it can have elements of that. But those conversations are in the service of, okay, so how is this going to make a difference in the way that we treat people, either on the clinical side or, in this case, on the research side. Bob Levine's discussion around the Belmont principles, and particularly respect for persons, I thought was interesting in the way that he framed it as a particularly American concept. He contrasted it with, he said, really the rest of the world, which has a much more communitarian ethos. But one of the things that I thought about first when I saw this little tagline of a title that said, respect for persons as an American notion, was Walt Whitman and Leaves of Grass, and this notion of an all-encompassing I, an I that means something more than just me. So, Leaves of Grass, it's all about I am this, sort of swelling notion of a person. But that I is never really meant to be just Walt Whitman. It's meant to be the American people. And so when he talked about respect for persons, what was the term that he used? It was autonomy, but he was taking it out of the Kantian description of the term. The ways that we can see that play out in a variety of American arenas, I think it was a particularly interesting thing about thinking about it as an American concept. I've ended up doing a lot of sessions with Alan Wertheimer over the years. And I have to say I was really intrigued by his take on informed consent, which is this have we treated people fairly model for consent. And he used the example, right, of the server, used the example of the server who says, well, here's this wonderful special, would you be interested in having it? And you say, oh yeah, that sounds great, and it comes to your table and you enjoy it, and afterwards you find out it's some egregious price that you would never have agreed to in the first place. And he asked the question, well, were you treated fairly in that model? You didn't ask about what the price of the special was, so maybe it's on you that it didn't, that you're in the position that you are now. If one were to just think that his model were based on that alone, I think we could be in some difficult areas. He does obviously build upon that notion. Dr. Veach said that consent is based upon what a reasonable person would want to know, plus or minus the specifics that a given subject, a given participant, would want to know in the specifics of their situation. And the reason I bring that up is I think that is where Dr. Wertheimer is really going as well. That what he wants to see is a very contextual, a contingent almost model for how we do consent, so that we don't have this sort of, is this person truly giving an autonomous answer, yes or no, with this sort of grand notion of autonomy, and anything that doesn't live up to that has failed to be fully autonomous. What I think Dr. Wertheimer was really trying to get to is, okay, so how do we create a model that's more responsive to individuals and their situation, that also accounts for both people in the interaction and the lacks on both sides, potentially, as well, too. I've heard him speak in other contexts where the way that came out was a way for him to get to giving more room for folks with varieties of capacity, room to make decisions for themselves. So I'm not sure that I agree with the exact frame that he puts around that, but I think where Dr. Wertheimer was going with that notion, that we really need to build this context-dependent notion that takes all parties into consideration, and then ask the question, well, were the people in this arrangement treated fairly? What would it take to make sure that they're treated fairly? And then build out our notion of consent from there. I thought that was very useful. I feel fortunate to be in an environment where I have relationships where people hear me. I know that that's not true for everybody. And one of the reasons that I continue to come here is to help figure out ways to make sure that others have more opportunity to be heard, whether it's at an IRB table or giving consent or anywhere else. So I feel fortunate that I don't have that type of challenge, but I feel, and again, it goes back to how do we hear people, which we did talk about earlier. However, I do think that on the research ethics side, because I have a concern about people's voices, I have an increasing concern about how we handle the need to have bigger and bigger projects that encompass more and more communities that then also make the need for oversight at a more distant remove more and more necessary. It's really hard to do this multi-site study when I've got 10 IRBs looking at it. They each want to put their fingerprints on it. And yet, this project is really important. You know, we're going to be able to gather good data. My concern is that in the process of that we lose the voice of the local IRB. And it was around, it was an attempt to have localities, have collections of communities be able to sort of speak their voice on what's important to them research-wise, how they feel morally, how they would go about things ethically, that local IRBs exist in the first place. However, I also see the need to have some centralized or different model for how we review these type of projects. Neither one of them is going to work on their own. And how we keep the conversation going between both local and, it's hard to think of a term that describes whatever level of distance or remove these larger, more centralized IRBs, whatever role that they would have. But it's going to take something about that. So I think a real challenge is to figure out how we keep all of these voices in conversation with each other simultaneously. And we as people are terrible about that. We don't do well with plurality. Yet we're moving into a situation more and more where we really need to take old school notions of pluralism, William James notions of pluralism, and figure out how to make them work. Our world always already has been a collection of different voices and different communities. Our ethics has not done a good job of representing that. We're now in a moment where our need to help figure out problems at these large scales is also putting us in a position where we're finding out that the way our ethics works has some deficiencies. And one of the ways that it's deficient is that it's spoken monivocally or univocally. And how we figure out ways to do ethics that have multiple voices engaged at the same time and not feel overwhelmed and not feel like just because two positions differ, that one of them has to be right and one of them has to be wrong. One of them has to be better and one of them has to be worse. It could be very well that we have multiple parties giving voice in ethical conversations that are all very different, but all just equally different. That they're not different and wrong, different and right. How we figure out ways to cope with, figure out ways to handle and process and to engage this variety of voices so that we have a really plural ethic, I think is it's an exciting challenge. It's a huge challenge. And I also think that it's a challenge that's becoming more and more immediate because of the type of research that we're seeing becoming more and more necessary.